Thanks, Nicola. To the latest instalment in our History Talks live series of talks, and we're delighted to welcome tonight Dr Emma Newlands from the University of Strathclyde, and very much looking forward to Emma's talk. Just a wee bit of housekeeping first of all, which I'm sure you all know, look at all the mute signs on the microphones. I think everybody's well versed in at the moment, but just a wee reminder when the talk is on, just to keep your mics muted using the mute button at the bottom left of your screen. While Emma's talking, if you have any questions that kind of come to you as the talk's progressing, feel free to pop them in the chat, and you can either come in and ask them yourselves later on, or I can do that for you if you prefer, or there will be an opportunity as well once Emma's finished talking to come in with your questions in virtual person as well. So yes, Emma Newlands is a lecturer in modern British history at Strathclyde University, and her particular research interests focus around war, medicine and military culture. And her talk that she's going to give tonight is entitled Fighting for Life, the Experiences of Men in the Royal Army Medical Corps during the Second World War. So without further ado, Emma, I'll hand over to you.
Okay, thanks, Alison. Thanks, Alison, and to Nicola for inviting me, not least because writing this paper has kind of forced me to go back and look at research that I started before COVID. And it's been really good actually to do research and not to do COVID-related teaching things all the time. That said, this is very much a working paper, so I do appreciate all feedback. Please be gentle with me. This is brand new research for me. And I am going to do that really annoying thing where I've changed the title, Alison. So I will just share my screen now and hope it works. I am not a WebEx person, so please do let me know. Just shout at me if something goes wrong. Right, can you guys all see that? Yeah, okay.
Yep.
Right, I'll just start this. Okay, now I can't see any of you, so this is slightly weird. I'm just in a room talking to myself, but please do, somebody please do shout out if something goes wrong with technology. So like I said, I have changed the title of this paper, and that's because of, well, I got into the archives and I got into the research, and I found this really interesting quote. So the title of my paper tonight is A Nurse and a Soldier, Men in the Ranks of the Royal Army Medical Corps During the Second World War. Okay, so I'll just make a start here. In the summer of 1940, Jack Sully, who was a nursing orderly with the 158th Welsh Field Ambulance, was deployed to Reykjavik, Ireland, to set up a hospital to receive casualties from the Battle of the Atlantic. Jack had joined the RAMC territorial force with his friend Ted early in 1939. On the anticipation of the outbreak of war. Both 19 years old and from middle-class Christian backgrounds and members of the Peace Pledge Union, Jack and Ted had not wanted to be called up and sent to combat units, so they felt that the RAMC offered a, quote, not too cowardly compromise. Having undergone basic military training in the UK and passed his nursing orderly exams, Jack worked long hours at the hospital in Reykjavik, caring for Allied personnel suffering from exposure, frostbite and gangrene. 50 years later, he described his day-to-day routine there, stating, "We had never envisaged the real schizophrenia of being both a nurse and a soldier at the same time. As a soldier, we had trained to march and drill, to wear heavy boots, and to accept the whole ethos of obedience to petty rules, which I came to realise was far more sensible methods of converting an individual into a member of a coherent unit than it first appeared. But now, we switched between the two roles several times every day. We would parade for breakfast, make beds and fold bedclothes into elaborate bundles. Boots had to be polished, belts blancoed, and kits lined up for inspection. Then we would go on nursing duties, suddenly transformed into white-gowned angels of mercy, walking on silent rubber shoes and pursuing a course of work and study practically identical with that followed by civilian nurses. Periods of guard duty would come up regularly, and in our non-nursing periods, when we would prowl camp in full military kit, maintaining fires, challenging whoever approached, and cursing the almost invariably cold and foul weather. Off guard at 4 a.m, through our transformation scene and back to the antiseptic world of discipline, totally dissimilar but just as stringent. It would have been reminiscent of Clark Kent going into a telephone booth as a reporter and coming out with Superman, but for the fact that we had never heard of Superman at that time. So Jack was one of around 100,000 men who served in the Royal Army Medical Corps, or the RAMC, as I'll probably refer to it mostly in this paper, during the war. And the majority of these men, like Jack, were recruited into the rank and file, so not professional doctors. Unlike their commissioned medical officers, most of them had absolutely no medical experience. Jack's account of his wartime service depicts this dual sense of identity, or perhaps more specifically, the double life that he experienced, sometimes a soldier, sometimes a medical caregiver. He describes these two roles as almost conflicting, always alternating and never really blending together, clearly defined by space and time. Indeed, he compares his experience in Reykjavik to perhaps the most well-known example of an alter ego, at least by the 1980s, Superman. I'm not really sure which one he casts as the hero in his own story. I think it's probably the nurse, based on his pacifist background and the use of his use of the term angels of mercy. But it's clear that he does see value in his military training. And actually, Jack goes on to abandon his pacifist beliefs and he becomes commissioned in the artillery. Ultimately, Jack's story is one of constant negotiation, straddling two worlds, but never fully in either. Drawing on the personal testimonies of men like Jack, this paper seeks to explore how recruits in the rank and file of the RAMC constructed a sense of identity in wartime. Social historians of the war have debated the transformative effects of the conflict on the lives of women and men, including military masculinities among combatants and gendered identities on the home front. Notably, Lindsay Robb has recently examined the subjective identities of conscientious objectors who served in other non-combatant roles. Yet men in the medical corps have not received much scholarly attention. Histories of war and medicine have examined in detail the impact of medical arrangements in various theatres, as well as the experiences of patients at the receiving end of medical care. These histories undoubtedly acknowledge the vital role played by frontline medical staff, but they do not put their experiences at the centre of the analysis. Scholarly work in this area has focused predominantly on the experiences of women who served alongside the RAMC as nurses and voluntary aid detachments, underpinned by notions of wartime caregiving as a fundamentally feminine practice. Research in the military, on the other hand, has centred on combatants and narratives of fighting as the appropriate role for men to take in wartime. So it's this gap in the literature that I want to explore. And I do so by looking at three main areas of RAMC experience, so recruitment, training, and active service. And my aim here is to try and understand how men felt about their roles as medical staff within the military organisation, how they viewed their preparation for service, and how they valued the work they carried out in the field. In order to do this, this paper draws on oral histories and unpublished memoirs of RAMC rank and file personnel held in the Imperial War Museum's archives in London. While these are subject to the same caveats as all personal reflections, for example, the issue of memory, they are highly revealing, providing glimpses into the attitudes, expectations, and motivations of men who occupied a distinct role as non-combatants in military uniform, whose goal was to preserve rather than to take life. Okay, so just a kind of a very basic history of the medical corps. The RAMC was established in 1898 after the importance of systemised medical support for troops had been demonstrated during the Napoleonic and Crimean Wars. There had been medical staff in the army since the 17th century, but they were not fully incorporated as military personnel. In 1873, the Army Medical Directorate was set up to provide training and education for doctors. And at the same time, the medical staff corps consisted of men who assisted the doctors. And the qualifications to be in the latter were that you had to be able to read and write and be, quote, of good temperament and disposition. The Royal Army Medical Corps brought together these two groups of men, and it played an important part in the Anglo-Boer Wars, where they worked in combat zones, like in the front line, treating 22,000 wounded and 74,000 soldiers suffering from disease. So at that time, disease was still a bigger killer than war wounds. The Corps reached its pinnacle during the First World War when over 167,000 men joined the ranks. There they are, nice dog. While their efforts were recognised as key to Allied victory, their status remained ambiguous. As Jessica Meyer argues, the Corps' work in bringing mercy, relieving wounds, and assuaging torment was not sufficient to lay claim to the full heroism associated with male military duty and sacrifice. The work and composition of the Corps did change measurably by the Second World War, driven by the demands of a more global and mechanised conflict. Medical staff had to operate close to a constantly moving front line, and troops deployed in desert, jungle, and Arctic environments presented new health issues, while advances in weapons caused more devastating effects on the human body. Added to this, interwar developments in medicine, coupled with improvements in service training and conditions, meant that the Royal Army Medical Corps became an ever-expanding corpus of specialist expertise and skills. Thus, the 70,000 men who were enlisted into the rank and file of the RAMC between 1939 and 1945 took on a multitude of jobs, including nurses, orderlies, stretcher bearers, clerks, cooks, operating theatre assistants, lab technicians, hygiene and sanitary assistants, dispensers, chiropodists, and optometrists. So there's just some examples of those kind of jobs there. So they weren't all, I suppose, like nursing staff, although that does seem to be the most common experience, being an orderly. The men who went on to occupy these diverse roles and responsibilities all started their military journeys in the same way as their combatant comrades. Some were already enlisted in the territorial or reserve forces. Some volunteered after the outbreak of war, while others waited to be called up under the National Service Acts, which imposed liability for service on all men aged 18 to 41, and that was later expanded to 51. Having been registered, eligible men would be called for a medical exam and a recruitment interview, after which they would be posted. While some attempts were made to select recruits with relevant technical knowledge or expertise, many were assigned what seemed randomly to medical service. And there's clearly a sense of bewilderment in some men's accounts as to why they ended up in the RAMC. G.H.C. Abram was enlisted in October 1940 and recalled, "Why I was called to the medics, I do not know." 22-year-old Don Caddick, who was a trainee accountant in Birmingham, was called up in February 1940, and he rather humorously wrote in his memoir, "When asked which regiment or corps I would prefer, I somewhat facetiously asked if I could have a horse. I'd done quite a lot of riding until the age of 10 years. I was told that I would probably, with my accountancy background, go into the RAMC. I could not then, have never since understood why I was put into the RAMC." And he actually went on to become a nursing orderly, which was a role he immensely enjoyed. Other men were very keen to join the medical services from early on. Aside from conscientious objectors, some were driven by humanitarian values. Joseph Day was trained as a gunner in the Territorial Army before the war started. But when he was called up in September 1939, he applied to be a medical orderly because, quote, "I thought if I can get somewhere I can help somebody. There's going to be a war. If I can do something regarding helping people, I'll do this." George Page volunteered for the Royal Army Medical Corps in 1942 and recalled later that, "I never wanted to be a soldier and I joined only with the intention of helping to save life." There were also pragmatic reasons for volunteering for the Medical Corps. Because he was short-sighted, Ruben Hiams passed the military medical exam as B2, which meant he was fit only for lines of communication, base or garrison service. He asked specifically for the RAMC because, quote, "I knew I was no good for building and rescue work like that. I couldn't drive, and I thought the next best thing I can learn is first aid," which I did. For Ruben, therefore, the RAMC offered a compromise. Knowing that he was going to be enlisted in some kind of non-combatant capacity, he chose a path that he felt would equip him with good hands-on skills. And it's true that men of lower physical standard were sometimes directed to the RAMC, as they were to other non-combatant units. Although I think it's important to note that many men who were graded A1, which was the highest medical category, like the fittest of men, if you like, did also enter the ranks of the RAMC, and we see this in lots of their testimonies. Yeah, a view certainly did prevail of the RAMC as something as a unit that was kind of less selective, perhaps a place for men who were unfit for combat duties. B.D. Harris joined the RAMC as a territorial in February 1939. He recalled, "The medical officer much, I must confess to my surprise, pronounced me fit for service." Continuing, he states, "I went home in high spirits that night and told my father I had been passed as fit. He was very pleased. He'd been a sergeant in the KRRs in the last war, and he was very keen on my passing, although I think that he was secretly disappointed that I had not chosen an infantry unit for my part. I was very keen on medical and scientific work, and I thought this would be a good opportunity to learn a bit more from experienced men." So even though he wanted to join the medical corps and he was happy that he got into the medical corps, he's very aware that this might be considered kind of less heroic or less manly than a combat role. And this was heightened by the fact that his dad was in the infantry, perhaps the most dangerous of all army occupations. And so he felt it was this that led to his father being disappointed in him, that he hadn't followed in his footsteps, which was something that a lot of soldiers did try to do in the Second World War, because their dads were of the age that they had fought in the First World War, and quite often they would try to volunteer for the same regiments. Peter Webb, on the other hand, was affronted when he was posted to the Medical Corps at the outbreak of war in September 1939. Peter had joined the Royal Artillery Territorial Force in January while working as a lab assistant at a distillery in Liverpool. During his time in the TA, he'd been hospitalised twice, once for jaundice and once for an infected ankle. When he received his compulsory transfer order to the RAMC, he quickly took action. He says, "I asked to see the battery commander to protest, but he informed me that the instruction had been forwarded to the regiment and it was because my civilian occupation had been involved in laboratory work, and that compulsory spoke for itself," he said. "There was a finality about it, and I felt very angry, and I was convinced that because I had been ill, the regiment wanted to get rid of me as a possible liability." So rather than accepting that his previous experience in lab work was the reason for his transfer, Peter believed he was moved to the RAMC because he was not fit enough for combat duties. And this kind of gives off the impression as the medical corps as a kind of like a dumping ground for men who weren't up to scratch for more elite regiments. And indeed, Peter spends most of his time in the RAMC trying to get out and get back into the artillery, which he's ultimately unsuccessful at doing. Once recruited into the RAMC, men underwent a period of training that, generally speaking, followed a similar pattern to any other branch or arm of the service. At the start of the war, they were recruited directly to regiments, where they underwent 6 weeks of basic training before receiving further training more specific to their role. For RAMC recruits, this meant 3 months, or 270 hours to be precise, of military and technical or medical training, usually undertaken at one of the RAMC's 3 depots at Aldershot, Leeds and Dalkeith. So this is number 1 and number 2 RAMC depots. The third one, strangely, was called number 11 RAMC depot, and that was in Leeds. I haven't been able to find a picture of it, but here you can see the other 2. So the main one, the first one to be established, was at Aldershot at Boyce Barracks, and the second one was at New Battle Abbey in Scotland in Dalkeith. Here, 120 hours were allocated to drill, physical exercises and chemical warfare training, while 150 hours were devoted to medical subjects, including anatomy and physiology, first aid, nursing, stretcher exercises and field work. So more time was dedicated to the medical side of the training than the military side, if you like. However, after the introduction of the General Service Scheme in early 1942, all new recruits went to general service depots where they would undertake 6 weeks of basic military training, along with aptitude tests to determine which jobs they were best suited for. So basically, the General Service Scheme was introduced because early on in the war, the army more generally found that men were being posted to units that they weren't really suited for. So they introduced this new scheme where kind of everyone went into a general training, I think primary training centre, where they received like very general military training, and they would observe them to see where they thought they should be posted. But for men in the RAMC, this meant that they now spent equal time doing military and medical training instead of slightly more time doing the medical training. And at the end of it all, they were expected to take what was known as the third class nursing orderly exam. So it didn't matter what occupation you were going into, you were expected to have basic nursing skills, basic first aid skills. Men's recollections of training are very similar to the experiences of men in other regiments, especially their early days of military life. They describe the food, the barracks, the uncomfortable beds, learning how to march, the rigours of physical training, and the kind of this idea that they transformed into these fitter, stronger men. Some accounts highlight the relatively easy nature of RAMC military training compared to combat regiments. For example, when it came to marching, V.D. Harris noted that being in the RAMC, our pace was much slower than the pace of the other mobs. We used to plod along at 180 to the minute and were continually pulling over to one side to allow the light-stepping lads of the LRBs and the Scottish almost dash past us. The sudden sound of their quick paces used to put us off our stride, and we invariably lost our step, much to the chagrin of us and the officers, and to the intense delight of the infantry. Other men commented on how kind of boring or mundane classroom study was. According to Peter Webb, who wasn't happy that he'd been put in the RAMC. Lessons on anatomy and physiology were, quote, very dull and didn't compare with riding motorcycles. So that's just an example of the kind of stuff that would be taught on the right-hand side from the Imperial War Museum. The left is a sketch from the Medical Services magazine, which was created sort of like by men for men. And it's obviously, there's a humorous kind of aspect to it. Yet it is equally common for men to have talked about how enjoyable and how strenuous the training was. For instance, instead of rifle drills, RAMC recruits would complete around 15 hours of stretcher exercises. And this is kind of a diagram of what stretcher exercises looked like. According to David Elliott, who volunteered as a conscientious objector and was 6'6", the exercises were, quote, always a laugh, because despite efforts to match men in height, his group was always lopsided because he was so tall. Like other combatant regiments, the RAMC also devoted much more attention in the Second World War to practical learning and more realistic field exercises, where men had to collect and treat casualties while exposed to kind of realistic battle conditions. So these are kind of examples of men trying to negotiate difficult terrains with casualties on stretchers. So that first one, and someone would kind of act as the casualty. So that's them trying to get them, I think, down the side of a mountain or cliff. The one on the right, or my right anyway, is they're trying to create a raft stretcher to go over the water. And these methods were not only designed to instill resourcefulness and improvisation skills, but they were lauded for the physical strength and the toughness that they demanded. So during the war, this is a film reel, a newsreel that would have been shown, at times like the break in cinema films, and it's just kind of given a depiction of RAMC training. Hopefully, this is going to work.
Whether they're in the mood or not, the tough guys of the RAMC get on with their strenuous training. Though they're non-combatant, they fight their way through a course of operations as realistic as any on the actual battlefield. The men drop to avoid shell splinters. A casualty post has been fixed up out of a 3-ton lorry and a tarpaulin, and a mobile ambulance in the form of a jeep is launched on an improvised boat. Under heavy fire, the floating ambulance is hauled across the river to collect the wounded, and in a little less than no time it's being rigged up to accommodate 4 stretchers. Resourcefulness in difficult situations is the keynote of the exercise. The casualties are off to the clearing station across the river. The boat, by the way, is made out of the superstructure of a lorry with a tarpaulin sheet. The floor is just the tailboards. improvisation doesn't stop there. 3 bales of straw wrapped in a tarpaulin sheet make a good raft, and ordinary spades good oars. When the RAMC have to use the hard way of getting wounded across the river, one of them first launches his kit wrapped in a waterproof gas cape and then swims across after it with a tow rope. Trees on the banks are linked with ropes, and by way of this crude but practical bridge, the stretcher bearers make the crossing. It's the way they have in the RAMC, the tough way in a tough struggle.
Yep, so that film was actually called, the title of it was Tough Guys of the RAMC, and again you can see that they're being portrayed as just as fit and just as manly as any other soldier. And we see this also reflected in men's accounts. B.D. Harris, trained in London in 1939, recalled, "Carrying patients under imaginary fire, we were pretty near exhausted at the end of the session. My shoulders and arms felt as if they were made of lead and hot fires ran through them." Training for medical service also imparted lessons in military law, namely the Geneva Convention and the protected nature of unarmed medics. And this aspect of their training and service more generally, I would say, tends to be mocked by men who seem to be quite cynical of it. Some men talk about being given a pickaxe handle to protect themselves when they were on guard duties in barracks. They were also issued with cards to carry that signified their medical status. Patrick Brown trained at No. 1 Depot in Aldershot in 1940, and he recalled the Sergeant Major telling them, quote, "A bullet will take a left or right turn if you hold that up." Equally cynical, Peter Webb, who again wanted out of the RAMC, who also trained at Aldershot, explained, "The most offensive weapons we had at our disposal," offensive being the operative word, "was bedpans. Imagine it, for inspection, pull up bedpans or present stretchers, equally difficult and ridiculous." Peter purposely failed his lab technician course, hoping again that it would result in a transfer, which it didn't. He was just given more domestic duties. So resigned to his fate, he decided to retake the the lab technician exam, and he passed it. He then travelled to Glasgow for embarkation overseas. While billeted at Maryhill Barracks, he recalls night out with his fellow RAMC rankers, stating,
Whether they're in the mood or not, the tough guys of the RAMC get on with their strenuous training.
"In order to show that we had potential as fighting men, we carried our jackknives, clearly in an attempt to cut a dash, which was impossible when attired in battle dress. On a lanyard round our waists, the knife was swinging freely above our right-hand trouser pocket, dressed thus, while attending a dance laid on in a local hall. I was very disconcerted when girls observing the knife asked if we used them for fighting. Vaguely recalling that knife-carrying gangs had been part of Glasgow culture, swiftly ended my attempts to cut a dash." So men were kind of unconvinced about their protected status, I think it's fair to say, and didn't feel that this was going to keep them safe. But for Peter Webb, the impact was more profound. Not only did he feel unsafe, he felt unmanly and found it hard to reconcile being in the army and being in uniform with not carrying a weapon. Having completed 3 months of training, RAMC recruits were then posted to operational units, either in hospitals in Britain, where they would receive further on-the-job or specialist training, or somewhere along the chain of evacuation overseas. And it was pretty common for men to do a stint in a hospital in Britain before they were posted overseas. Men enjoyed the practical experience of working in operational hospitals, which they felt was more useful than the theoretical training they'd had in camps. Prominent in many memories is the first experience of a post-mortem, which men in all different trades were often asked to observe as part of their kind of, I guess, their development as medics. And there was a real sense of pride among those who could stick it out and who didn't faint, basically. David Elliott saw a post-mortem at Netley Hospital in 1939, which, quote, "was quite a revelation. Lots of men fainted, but I thought it was worthwhile. It was a good experience." B.D. Harris watched a post-mortem at St Mary's Hospital in London, and he recalled, "It was rather unnerving to watch the doctors as they split him up the middle and pulled back the flesh, exposing his chest bones. They then put a circular instrument round his head and turned a screw at the side. The circle began to close and bite into his head until there was only a small part at the back untouched, rather like the opening of a tin of fruit." They then lifted the top of his head back and exposed the brain. This was a bit too much for some of the lads, and some of them had to go outside. Strangely enough, I was able to stick it out. It was a great experience. So again, there's this definite sense of pride in not being squeamish. Once deployed overseas, medical staff were now faced with the task of collecting and treating the sick and injured. Orderlies, technicians, hygiene assistants and operating theatre assistants worked in a series of medical posts that were designed to move casualties gradually away from the front line to the safety of base hospitals. Moving between these posts were stretcher squads, field ambulances and motor ambulance convoys, transporting the sick and injured along the chain of evacuation. And this is just an image here of a field ambulance travelling to Normandy and D-Day, and it just kind of shows like the scale of the operation. So these were the mobile units that would actually like sort of go back and forth between the medical posts. So they've got the kind of the trucks there that they would transport people in, but also a lot of this was done on foot. So just to explain the chain of evacuation in a bit more detail here. Once injured, having been collected from the battlefield or walked if he could, a soldier would first be taken to a regimental aid post where his injuries would be assessed and given immediate treatment. If necessary, he would be taken to an advanced dressing station, which essentially acted as a collecting station and really only offered the most urgent treatment, so for example, for shock. He would then be taken to a field dressing station where he was again inspected and given any necessary treatment. He might proceed to an advanced off-field surgical unit, which was fully equipped to operate. And if his wounds were more serious, he would pass to a casualty clearing station where he would receive full medical treatment, so possibly more surgery. And at the earliest opportunity, he'd be sent to a general hospital, usually established at the base or along the lines of communication before evacuation by ship back to Britain. So RAMC recruits worked in a vast network of medical sites and under many different conditions, depending on the arena they were in and the conduct of the war at that time. And what I'm kind of interested in trying to explore is how important these different spaces were to men's experiences and to their attitudes to their work. And I think we can see lots of differences, but also lots of similarities, based particularly on their caregiving roles. First of all, RAMC men working in hospitals and dressing stations worked alongside female nurses, who now work closer to the front line and in greater numbers than ever before. So nurses had, women did have a long history of caregiving in the military, both as professional nurses and as voluntary aid detachments, and they had served in combat zones in the First World War, but they were very much more integrated into the forces in the Second World War. So ward sisters were commissioned as lieutenants. So this would mean that they were actually above the rank of an RAMC kind of orderly, which was new. Men tend to recall being bossed around by the ward sisters, who often complained about their domestic skills. And domestic duties are something that kind of come up a lot in men's accounts of hospital work when they're talking about service, either both in Britain and overseas. And they tend to describe it as quite pointless or mundane, which perhaps reflects kind of wider gender stereotypes. Jack Sully described the nurses at the hospital in Reykjavik as relentless taskmasters or mistresses who soon earned themselves nicknames such as Black Death. Jack and a colleague attempted to speed up the process of bed making by working individually rather than in pairs. Although Jack claims that this was much quicker, the ward sister, quote, gave a condescending smile before dismissing the idea outright. And he clearly thinks that this is about her exercising her authority rather than kind of the most efficient way to get the job done. At the same time, working in operational hospital settings could mean that the strict divisions of military hierarchy between men became more ambiguous, as orderlies and officers worked together outside of the strict disciplinary environment of the training depot or barracks. And again, this is something that you do see in the army more generally, where once men get into the field of operations, the supervision by superiors can become more relaxed. But for men in the Royal Army Medical Corps, it seems to have been precisely the medical nature of the work that brought them together. And this is something that a lot of them comment on. And this was because of the fact that almost all medical officers had been civilian doctors. who were commissioned on entry into the armed forces. So they weren't kind of used to, or they weren't interested in the sort of formal strictures of military discipline. Nursing orderly Patrick Brown recalled, quote, "They treated you entirely different. They weren't regimental at all. I mean, they'd done their training in the TA, but they were still doctors, really." Jack Sully likewise described the men at the hospital in Reykjavik as an unmilitary group. And he stated, "A peculiar fact of this comedy was the way in which the officers, all of whom were doctors, except for the quartermaster, reacted to be suddenly given the capability to become petty disciplinarians. Most of them thought nothing of it, accepted the officer status without enthusiasm, and got on with the job of being a doctor. A few were contemptuous of the officer other ranks conventional division and ignored it to the best of their ability." And here we get this kind of sense of solidarity that stems directly from the medical backgrounds of the officers who ultimately remain civilians, and the idea that they were all kind of just there to get on with the job. Indeed, the distinction between medical and non-medical personnel became most obvious when the two came together. So as Jack's story here tells us, quartermasters were the only members of RAMC units drawn from the regular forces, and this was because the job was mainly administrative. And their differences in character were often noted by other men. Later, Jack worked in a hospital at a rest camp in southern Italy that was set up in a monastery. He described the quartermaster as, quote, "cast in a different mould, tough with the drinker's florid complexion and a regular soldier's limited but expressive vocabulary." And because Jack spoke Italian, he was used as a translator when the quartermaster and the Mother Superior had to discuss kind of matters relating to the running of the hospital. And he's got a bit of sort of a funny story here. This is what would happen in these kind of exchanges. "Tell her that we expect the beep laundry to be ready by 12 o'clock every bleep day with no bleep excuses." I would translate this into polite Italian, and the Mother Superior would give her courteous reply with her beaming gaze full in my face. Then I would translate this back to English, but add on the four-letter embellishments, without which the quartermaster would not think that she meant it. So he very clearly delineates the regular soldier from the medic, even within the RAMC unit. For men working outside of aid stations and hospitals, perhaps the most common feature of their experience was the immediate threat to life. Stretcher squads, for example, went out into the battlefield to collect the wounded, hoping that the white armbands that they wore with red crosses would protect them, while jeeps and ambulances transported casualties, again, within the fighting zone. So in this respect, medical staff faced the same dangers as combatant troops, although perhaps even more so because they were unarmed. Forward aid post and casualty clearing station staff were, however, equally at risk when the enemy engaged, and could even be the target of enemy fire, despite the protections that were meant to be afforded by the presence of a Red Cross outside. In fact, some men say that they didn't put the Red Cross up outside precisely because it made them a target. Indeed, not only did medical staff have to protect themselves, they were also responsible for the safety of the patients under their care. Ruben Hiams was an orderly at a casualty clearing station in Tobruk in 1941. He recalled that during air raids, the staff would move patients who could be moved to slip trenches. Then some of them would remain on the ward with the patients that couldn't be moved. Despite being, quote, very frightened, Ruben stated, "I couldn't show that fear to the men who had already been wounded." So not only did he have to cope with his own fear, but he had to try and mitigate the effects of fear for others, which must have been incredibly stressful. Working in the combat arena was also incredibly physically demanding. Stretcher squads often had to carry men for several miles over rough terrain, while aid post and hospital staff worked long hours, especially during big campaigns. Jack described the day-to-day hospital routine of life and death in Italy, stating, "Unlike many arms of the service, which had more dangerous and adventurous jobs than that of a field hospital, we rarely had any let up from the work, which varied in intensity but never failed to keep us busy." So while he perhaps didn't see his job as dangerous, he does see it as more demanding in terms of the endurance that it required. G. Abram worked at a casualty clearing station in Tunisia in December 1942. He described how the surgical teams worked on a rota system, taking 100 casualties each in turn. And he said, "Very often we had to work 48 hours at a stretch, stopping only for short periods for something to eat. On one occasion, we worked for 75 hours, except for short intermittent breaks for meals, sometimes actually falling asleep on our feet. He also described the job of having to turn patients every hour to prevent pressure sores. Considering that there were over 40 patients in the ward, this was quite a mammoth task. It was something like painting the Forth Road Bridge, for no sooner had we reached the last patient than it was time to start all over again. So in addition to working long hours, the nature of the work itself was physically strenuous. Finally, RAMC medics in the field had a shared experience in being confronted with the most horrifying effects of war on human bodies and minds. Personal accounts are full of graphic depictions of wounds, which have clearly become imprinted on men's memories. Peter Webb worked in a field dressing station in Anzio in 1944 and recalled men who were, quote, shivering with trauma and the terrible cold, every one of them deadly pale and marble-hued. He described gaping holes in their flesh, dollops of coagulated blood, thigh muscles sliced from hip bone to knee, flopping out of the cutaway trousers, protruding intestines and brain tissue. And these confrontations with injured bodies, again, they don't necessarily distinguish the medic's experience from that of the combatant soldier who also witnessed incredibly traumatic sights and events. However, medical personnel carried an added burden of having to try and save, or at least trying to comfort the men who had the most devastating wounds. Ronald Pett served as an NCO with the 224th Parachute Field Ambulance in Northwest Europe in 1944. He encountered one young soldier who had been hit at close range by a grenade. He says that he was completely shocked when, quote, as I opened up his tunic and belt trousers, his whole gut just fell away, and he looked at me and he said, I've had it, haven't I? And all you can say at such a time is, no, that's okay. Don't worry, you'll be okay. G. Abram also recalled that in Italy, we saw some gruesome sights, often heartbreaking if you allowed yourself to become emotionally involved, which we dare not do, as this would lessen our efficiency. It is not that we were devoid of compassion. On the contrary, we were appalled at the disgraceful waste of life and the maiming of thousands of young lads, some barely 19 years of age. We once had a young lad brought into the theatre who was the only survivor of a gun crew. He could not have been more than 20 years old. He had lost both of his legs and one arm. He was virtually only a torso. Apparently, a shell had exploded in the breech of a gun, and he and his mates were manning. We literally poured pints and pints of plasma into him with no avail. He lost blood faster than we could replace it. And this is quite a common feature in men's narratives where they recall a particular case that had a lasting impact on them. Added to this was the responsibility of choosing who to treat first, which meant selecting the most serious cases, but with the greatest likelihood of survival. And although this was meant to be the job of professional medical staff or medical officers, aid posts in hospitals were often too busy, making the responsibility of men lower down the ranks. At Anzio, Peter Webb described the burden of almost acting as God and having to decide who we considered should go for immediate surgery and those who might be able to be treated later. And those for whom neither surgery nor any other treatment could possibly save them. Even now, 60 years later, I still worry that we couldn't have done much more. So this responsibility weighed very heavily on Peter, and it clearly had a profound and lasting impact on him. Yet looking after wounded servicemen was also very rewarding and gave men a real sense of purpose. George Page worked as a nursing orderly in a field ambulance in Italy in 1942, and he recalled, being in charge of sick and wounded people gives one the opportunity to talk with them. Men from many parts of the home country, distant and unknown to me. Men from the Commonwealth and from so many foreign countries. Men whose skins are different from ours, black, brown, yellow men. At some time or other, all these pass through our hands, and part of our duties, and also part of the treatment to help restore these men to health and strength again, was to listen to their stories and to talk to them. Very often, they would relate intimate and personal stories of their families and homes and of the countries of their origin. So George very much saw his role as one of emotional support, as well as being a kind of a clinician or a medical caregiver. For him, working as a medic was as much about treating minds as it was about treating wounds. Okay, so just to conclude. So what did it mean to be in the ranks of the RAMC during the Second World War? This is a hard question to answer, and I'm still not sure I know, but the observations that I've made so far are that in the pre-active active service stages of military service, men seem to have felt very much like other soldiers. They were subject to the same disciplinary regimes and tough physical exercises as men who went on to become combat troops. However, there was also a distinct RAMC identity based on the medical knowledge that they acquired and the skills that they gained. At the same time, there was a scepticism of their place in the military based on the fact that they were unarmed. And for some, this meant unmasculine. In the field of operations, we see more distinct identities emerge that were often related to the specific military and medical arena in which men worked. Again, like other branches of the army, men in the RAMC had to negotiate different relationships, environments, and tasks. Some faced more immediate dangers than others. Some required more physical stamina and endurance, while others felt a greater emotional toil. Ultimately, all of the men included in this paper seem to have found value in what they did and the contributions that they made, even Peter Webb, who wanted to be in the artillery. And this distinguished them not just as non-combatants, but as servicemen who preserved and saved lives. Thank you. I'll stop sharing now. Hopefully.
Lots of applause emojis coming out in case you can't see those.
I can't see them yet, but I'm there we go.
Hopefully you can see us all now, and you've
I'm
got
back,
company
yeah.
again. Thank you very much, Emma, for that really interesting, really insightful talk with lots of fascinating material in there. I think I'll need to get a copy of the stretching exercises for my desk. We do have some time for questions for Emma, which if you want to put them in the chat and ask them that way, then I can read them out, or if you want to ask them yourselves, that's also fine. While you're thinking, I might use Chair's prerogative and ask just an initial one, if that's all right, and maybe roll back to the extract you had right at the start from of Jack Sully's account, saying that his experience was reminiscent of Clark Kent going into the telephone box and coming out as Superman, but for the fact we'd never heard of Superman. It sort of got me thinking about whether you'd come across anything that indicated any sort of changes with the passage of time and with the impact of public memory and the cultural circuit on the reflections of these men, of their experiences, and I suppose particularly those who talked about trying to get out and trying to get into different services, and perhaps felt that felt the perceptions of the RAMC as less selective, as you talked about earlier on. Yes, so I don't know if you'd come across anything that.
Well, most of the material that I've used, at least here, it is like sort of 40 or 50 years post service, and I don't know. I don't know how perceptions of kind of medical military service have changed in that time, if they have, but I definitely think that there's a huge sense of pride in it. I mean, even Peter Webb, who didn't really want to be in the RAMC, in the end he's happy about it, and he, you know, after he kind of resigns himself to the fact, and then he takes the job very seriously. So I don't know. I would imagine that the cultural circuit does have an impact, because it always does, right? But I don't know how at this point.
Yeah, always leaves more questions, like that kind of question. Does anybody else have any questions they'd like to ask Emma at the moment?
Hi, Alison. I shoved my hand up, but it may not be working.
Yeah, sorry, so Ian, I didn't notice.
I'm just jumping in now. Anyway, hello, Emma, and first of all, my apologies for my late arrival. I had an overrunning previous meeting, so I may have missed this. I actually have two questions, but I'll confine myself to one at the moment. So most of the material you were quoting from there looked to me like it was lodged in the Imperial War Museum. So are those your interviews? Forgive me for not knowing this. or are they written memoirs? I really wasn't sure of the status of those. So
okay,
yeah.
So some of them were written memoirs that are unpublished, that they, I guess, men just decided to write down their memories a few years later. And some of them are oral histories, which were conducted by the museum. The museum has an ongoing project of trying to collect lived experiences of war. And actually, Second World War now, it's probably pretty hard to get many people. So most of them were conducted kind of in the, well, anywhere really from like the 80s up until kind of like, I think I have one that's 2019, but I've not seen anything later than that, but they are all reminiscences.
So if I may be permitted a follow-up question then to that. So you're using kind of, forgive me if I'm wrong, oral histories that other people have collected. Yeah. So how was that for you as a experience as a historian, shall we say? You know, what would you say are the kind of the perils and pitfalls, and you know, advantages of doing that?
Well, before this, I actually had done a project on kind of on the flip side of it, where I look at the experiences of men who were in regular service. I use that archive extensively. For me, I think, well, first of all, again, it would be really difficult to try and do oral histories now, I think, with people who'd served in the Second World War. I think the window's almost closed for that. So it's obviously incredibly useful just as a place where you can get them, and it's really convenient because they're all there and they're all in one place. You do have to trawl through a lot of stuff that ends up becoming like that isn't relevant. I would say the catalogue's quite good, but it's not perfect. So you do listen to a lot of stuff that you end up not being able to use or read stuff. But I think it's a fantastic resource, and like it's obviously perfect for someone like me who does this research, that it exists. Yeah.
Did you ever get frustrated by you know, a line of questioning that you would have pursued slightly differently, but you were unable to ask them?
I'm not, I don't get frustrated about, but I sometimes do think that the interviewers are like really not very good at their jobs, because they do like really lead the men down certain avenues. The oral histories follow quite a set structure. It's, you know, what was your life like before the war? Tell us about your recruitment. Tell us about your service. But they do push them on certain things, I would say. But what I also think is really good is the fact that so much of what I'm interested comes up in the interviews without me having like interrogated the men for that. So I can't be accused of kind of like myself of guiding the narratives. They just, you know, they just do talk about stuff that I'm interested in, which is great.
Thanks very much.
And I should say, actually, in relation to what Emma said there about her earlier research, that her book, Civilians into Soldiers, War, the Body and British Army Recruits, it was published in 2014, is that?
A long time ago, yeah.
So if anyone's interested in reading more on that, that's a good starting point. There's a question in the chat from Nicola who says that was really interesting, and she wonders where you're planning to take your research going forward.
Yeah, so this is kind of part of a funded project that I'm doing, and the plan is to expand it to look at all men in the RAMC. So I'll be looking at the professional medics as well, and looking more in depth at different sort of aspects of the experience, particularly this idea of them being like these kind of non-combatants who work really close or in the combat zone, because obviously there are other non-combatants in the army, but I think that the medics are the ones who really go to the front in much the same way as the combat soldiers. So it's part of a bigger project on the RAMC in the Second World War. It's just, yeah, this is the kind of my very early sort of findings.
We've got 1 minute left, but we've probably got time for one more question or a couple more questions if anyone's got any others they would like to ask.
Can I ask my second question if nobody else is jumping?
Go ahead, Ian. Go ahead.
Well, thank you very much. So I'm really interested in the radicalization of soldiers, particularly in the context of the First World War. And I'm wondering, I haven't thought about, kind of the differentiation between the type of soldiering you do. So I'm wondering if you uncovered any sense of radicalization from within this particular cohort. We have the first Labour, really radical Labour government immediately after World War II, and I'm wondering, is there any connection there? Is there anything? Are people radicalized by being in the medical corps in the same way that they might have been in the general soldiering unit?
It's a great question. It's not something I've come across just yet. I think a lot of the men, and not just sort of registered conscientious objectors, but men who just had more pacifist beliefs, they do seem to be very kind of politically aware, and they talk a lot more about kind of the ethics and the that kind of side of the job. But I haven't come across like radicalization at this point, but again, I am like in the very early kind of stages of this work. So, and I do plan to kind of look at where I can, at, what happened to them after the war, because a lot of them tried to get jobs that were related to the service. They felt that this had really kind of, given them a job like trajectory. That they wouldn't have thought of before, which is interesting. So, but as for radicalization, I'll keep an eye out for it.
And I think there's another question come up in the chat from Lucy asking, do you know much about the background of the men whose memoirs and interviews you've used?
Yeah, so I mean, some of them give much more detail than others. I would say the men who provide written memoirs tend to be more kind of middle class. The oral histories tend to come more from the sort of, I suppose, more working class recruits. Most of them were kind of, I mean, you could get, obviously, if you were a conscientious objector, you could be. So there's one guy who, because he was a conscientious objector and he didn't want to join a combatant unit, he ends up in like the rank and file of the RAMC as a stretcher bearer. But he's actually from a very, like, he went to public school. So he's kind of like, men like that are kind of odd in that they, in any other kind of context, they would be officers, but they're not, because they don't want to fight. So, because in the RAMC, you're only commissioned if you are a doctor, if you've got medical, if you're a medical professional. So you do get, I would say it's possibly it's a more middle class rank and file than other units, because of the men who are there kind of for their beliefs. But a lot of them are just very general, like working class guys from cities. The RAMC did obviously try to recruit people with technical skills. So again, that kind of lended itself towards a slightly more like middle class cohort. But I would just say it's a real mix at this point. For the rank and file, obviously, the medical officers, they're all people who've been to medical school. So that's a very different cohort.
And any very, very last questions? We probably do a wee sneaky short one if anyone's got a last one, or no. Okay. In that case, we're over time now, but I just wanted to say thank you very much again, Emma, for your talk. I think it'd be really interesting to see where your research goes going forward, especially with what you've said about your future directions for it, and we'll look out for more on your findings from that. And there's more applause emojis coming up for you if you can't see them, or you wonder if there's something else. Just just before everybody goes, just a wee reminder that the next History Talks live talk, and indeed the last one before Christmas, will be from the Centre for History's Dr Elizabeth Ritchie, and she will be giving a talk entitled Emigrant Families at Sea, Scottish Migration to Canada from the 1770s to the 1850s, and that will be on Thursday the 16th of December, also at 5:30, so it would be great to see as many as possible there. But I think that concludes the talk for today, and yes, a huge thank you again, Emma.